say thank you all for being here. I love that we've got some new faces in here, and hopefully we'll get each other's names if we don't know each other's names yet, but we're starting to get everybody's names figured out here. We are back to the book of Genesis today after taking a break last week for Easter in the book of John. We've been studying about Abraham and Isaac, and now we've been talking about Jacob, and I love today's story. And we're in chapter 30, but I'm going to also do a little bit of a review of what came before chapter 30, because of course our focal verses skip right over chapter 29, and there's some good stuff in there. It's kind of a fascinating story, what's happening in the book of Genesis right before we get to our verses in chapter 30. So I'm glad to have all of you here today, and I'm happy for all of you who are watching online. My name is Shirley Haugen, and I'm just happy to have you here with us. If you remember, before Easter, we were back in chapter 28 of Genesis, and in that story, we learned about how Jacob, as he was traveling to his uncle Laban's house, he had this dream where he saw the stairway to heaven, and he saw the angels ascending and descending on the stairway. And we know, of course, after talking about that 2 weeks ago, that stairway to heaven is really a representative of Jesus, because Jesus is the way that God gives us to be the way to heaven, the way to get to God. And so he's on this journey. If you remember, the reason Jacob is on this journey on his way to Uncle Laban's house is because, one, he needed to find a bride from his own family. So he's going in search of his bride. His father Isaac sent him to look for the right woman to marry. And then there's also another reason he's going, and that's because his brother Esau is plotting to kill him. His brother Esau is mad because he stole the blessing. He tricked his father Isaac into giving him the blessing instead of Esau. And when Isaac and Esau found out, they were furious, and Esau is plotting to kill him as soon as his father dies. So he's also fleeing his brother. So he's off to see his uncle Laban. And in chapter 29, Jacob finally arrives in Haran. That's the land where his uncle Laban lives. And of course, the first thing you do after a long journey is you stop at the well, because he's thirsty and he probably needs to get a drink of water. And we know from other Bible stories that the well happens to also be a very good place to find a suitable bride. Because apparently women
just like the water cooler at work.
Exactly, just like the water cooler at work. There you go, Dave. So women tend to gather there to get their water. So in our story in before our story in chapter 29, there's a lot of people gathering there with their sheep. And it just so happens that Laban's youngest daughter, Rachel, is a shepherdess, and she is taking care of what few sheep that Laban has, and she's brought them to the well for a drink of water. And so isn't it coincidental that she meets Jacob right there at the well? And we know that Jacob goes to stay at his uncle Laban's house where Rachel lives, and he falls in love with Rachel. The Bible says that Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. So, of course, he falls in love with her. Now, Laban he had two daughters, but his oldest, Leah, had weak eyes. I don't know what that means. She has weak eyes, but you get the impression that she's not as attractive as Rachel is. I wonder, when I read that, I think, today we use that term, we say somebody has a lazy eye. It usually means they're a little bit cross-eyed, or, because they've got a weak eye or a lazy eye that's not tracking with the other one. So I wonder, was Leah...
Or maybe she just couldn't see, and it becomes that, you wouldn't see her just standing there, but as she moves around, it would be evident that she can't navigate.
And so we don't know what that means. We don't know what that means. Was she have trouble with her eyesight? One of the commentators, and by the way, there's no agreement on this. Bible commentators are all over the map on what does it mean when it says Leah has weak eyes. But one of the comments was that maybe she just didn't have that spark in her eye for Jacob the way Rachel did. Yeah. I don't know. But we know that Jacob falls for Rachel. And so Laban, who was the father of Leah and Rachel, he tells Jacob that, hey, he deserves to get paid for his work there around the household. And so he asked him what his wages should be. And so Jacob says that he would be more than happy to work for Laban for a full 7 years if he could have Rachel's hand in marriage. at the end of the 7 years. And they agreed. So they had this agreement that he would work for Laban, his uncle, for 7 years, and then he would be able to marry Rachel. Genesis 29 verses 20 through 21 say, so Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her. That's the version I read it from. So Laban, Uncle Laban, he gathered everyone for this big celebration feast. But when evening came, he tricked Jacob, and he sent his oldest daughter, Leah, into the honeymoon chamber, so to speak, instead of Rachel. And for some reason, Jacob didn't notice that it was Leah. Maybe it was dark, he couldn't see. Maybe he had had a little bit too much wine at this celebration meal. But for some reason, he didn't realize this until the next morning after the marriage had been consummated. Then he woke up and he was very disappointed to find that it was Leah at his side, not Rachel. And so Jacob went to Laban to complain. He says, what is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? So he's very brokenhearted, I think, and disappointed and all kinds of things. Genesis 29:26, Laban replied, it is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work. Can you believe that? This is where Laban's greedy personality starts to really show up here, because he was using Jacob's love for Rachel to take advantage of Jacob and basically enslave him. I mean, even though he is there willingly, he really is taking advantage of him.
He showed a little bit of that whenever his sister Rebecca came in with some gold on her.
Uh-huh.
When Eliezer went to get Isaac's bride, and
Yeah.
so he kind of showed a little bit of that hint. But it's kind of what goes around comes around here with the deceiver.
Yes.
Jacob the deceiver.
That's exactly right, because Jacob means deceiver. So Laban asked him to stay another 7 years, and you know what? Jacob's love for Rachel was so great that he happily agreed. And so he slept with Leah and was attentive to her for a week, and then he got his precious Rachel. And he was there to continue to work for Laban to earn Rachel a second time, basically. So now he's up to 14 years. And so it says in verse 28, he finished, and this is still in chapter 29, he finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years. So Jacob has 2 wives, and he loves one more than the other, and there's going to be problems, right? That's just cannot be a good situation in the home with this going on. So Genesis 29:31 says that when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And so this is where we get to Jacob's family tree. So that family tree I wrote up there is a mess. I don't know if any of y'all can read it. But we see here that Leah ends up being very productive, and she has 4 children. She has Reuben, Simon, Levi, and Judah. So she has 4 children. She's just popping them out, right? So God blesses her with children. And then in Genesis 30, we get to verse 1 in chapter 30. It says, when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, give me children or I'll die. Jacob became angry with her and said, am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children? Like, it wasn't his fault. He was doing his part, I think, right? It just wasn't happening. And then she said, here is Bilhah, my maidservant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children from me, and through her, I too can build a family. And I don't know about you, but doesn't that sound familiar?
Yep.
That sounds a lot like the story we had with Abraham and Sarah. When Sarah got her maidservant Hagar to sleep with Abraham because they got impatient. And instead of waiting for God to give Sarah a baby, she she used Hagar to kind of force that family situation to happen a little sooner than God had planned it. And so now in this family tree, what's happening, Rachel gives her servant Bilhah to Jacob, and that maidservant has 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. That's number 5 and 6. And you know, when that happened, Leah, for some reason, after she had her first 4 sons, she stopped having children for a while. And so, not to be outdone by Rachel, she said, well, I can do that too. I'll give him my maidservant, Zilpah, and Zilpah can give him a son. And so Zilpah has 2 sons, Gad and Asher. So now Jacob is up to 8 children. And then we get into kind of a really interesting story. You can't make these stories up. These Old Testament stories are just sometimes unbelievable, the drama that goes on. And so we get to this interesting story about the mandrake plants. The fruit of the mandrake is supposedly an aphrodisiac, and it was also eaten to increase fertility. And so we have this story, and this is in Genesis starting in verse 14. It says, during wheat harvest, Reuben went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too? Very well, Rachel said, he can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him. You must sleep with me, she said. I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he slept with her that night. Don't you love the Bible? So what's interesting is that after this mandrake story, and you know, these plants supposedly had some magical power. I don't know. By the way, in history, mandrakes have also been used in witchcraft and all kinds of weird things. The root of the mandrake plant can be poisonous if you eat too much of it. It has a narcotic effect, but the berries are supposed to be the aphrodisiac. They're safe to eat, and they believe that they can increase your fertility. And so it's interesting that it's after this story, Leah gets pregnant again, and she has 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun. And so now there's number 9 and 10. And
all boys?
They're all boys so far, but it's shortly after Zebulun, I think, and I don't know how much time has elapsed. This all happens, this whole family tree, except for number 12, happens in the course of the 7 years that Jacob is there. It's his second 7 years he is there. So it's interesting that after she had her 5th and 6th son, Leah also had a daughter, Dinah. And so there was a daughter mentioned finally. And so it's also interesting that after the mandrake story, Rachel finally gets pregnant. And she gets pregnant and gives birth to Joseph, number 11. Now we know, in fact, let's see, there's the whole thing with the mandrakes that seems to be working, and that it seems to make the wives fertile. But we also know that there's going to be another 12th son that is born to Rachel, but that doesn't happen until after they return later on back to the promised land. So this actually gets us back to our verses today. Dave, would you read to us? We're going to be in Genesis 30. Just read verses 25 through 34, the first part of our verses for us.
All righty. Now it came about when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and my own country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me depart for yourself. Let me depart, for you yourself know my service which I have rendered to you. But Laban said to him, if now it pleases you, stay with me. I have divined that the Lord has blessed me on your account. He continued, name me your wages, and I will give it. But he said to him, you yourself know how I have served you and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it was increased to a multitude. And the Lord had blessed you wherever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also? So he said, What shall I give you? And Jacob said, You shall not give me anything. If you'll do this one thing for me, I will again pasture and keep your flock. Let me pass through your entire flock today, removing from them every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black one among the lambs, and the spotted and the speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later. When you come concerning my wages, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, will be considered stolen. Laban said, Good, let it be according to your word.
Thank you. So this story gets kind of interesting because now it's been 14 years. Jacob has basically served his time. I don't know if you're pronouncing it Laban. I've been saying Laban. However you say.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah, I don't know.
I just say it however it comes out.
Yeah.
And sometimes it changes.
Well, then I'm right.
Yeah, exactly. For sure. So Jacob has been serving Laban for 14 years, and he wants to go back to the promised land. He knows that's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to have his family and raise them in the promised land. And so Jacob goes to Laban to ask for permission to go back home with his family. But Laban is greedy, and he realizes how much Jacob has enriched him over these last 14 years. Because with Jacob there, the flocks have been multiplying. And, back then, that's how you measured your wealth, was by the size of your flocks. How many animals and servants did you have? And it's interesting, in verse 27, Laban says, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. So he is using some kind of fortune telling that's probably not from God. And that's enlightened him to the fact that the reason he is doing so well, he's so prosperous, is because of Jacob. And so
yours says divination?
Divination.
Okay, yeah. Okay, mine's, well. Okay.
What does yours say?
Divine. And so I thought that was intuited somehow, but divination is probably better.
Yeah, I think you use some other worldly way of predicting the future or making sense of the world. It's not from God necessarily.
Yeah, and that's what, when you were saying the root, like you were saying.
The roots of the plants.
Yeah, the one that,
they're used sometimes in witchcraft and making potions.
Yeah,
and
I guess
things.
that wasn't prohibited until the New Testament.
And those roots of the mandrakes were also used because they do have a narcotic effect when taken in the right quantities. In ancient world, they were used in surgeries. Mm-hmm. So, there's some interesting history about all that. But we get, from that verse, we get a clue that Laban is not necessarily a godly man, right? So he's not necessarily seeking God's guidance, because he's seeking wisdom from other sources, not from God. And of course Laban adds, name your wages and I will pay them, because he at this point he's like, I'll pay you anything, just stay here and keep making me rich, right? And so Jacob makes a deal with Laban. He says he will stay if he gets paid, and he agrees that he will just take the blemished and spotted animals from the flocks, and Laban will get to keep the nice, unblemished animals. So basically, Laban gets the pretty white sheep, and Jacob gets the ugly, spotted, and blemished ones. And that's going to be Jacob's wages. But there's some deception that goes on. In the verses that we skip over, we know that Laban gets his other sons, and he gets them to take all the blemished animals and remove them from the flock and sends them on like a 3-day journey. Mm-hmm. So there won't be any animals for Jacob to take for his own. So already Laban is he's being greedy to the point that he is harming his son-in-law. And what's funny to me about Laban too, this also says a lot about his character. He doesn't want Jacob to leave with his family because he's greedy, right? He wants Jacob to continue making him wealthy. He doesn't mention anything about the fact that he might miss his children or his grandchildren. Mm-hmm. That's not an issue with him. He's just worried about the prosperity that he's going to lose when Jacob leaves the household. So immediately Laban starts to trick Jacob, but you know what? Jacob, who's known as the deceiver himself, they're kind of a good match for each other in a sense, because he finds a way to make sure that he does get his share of the flocks multiplied. In fact, if you read forward into chapter 31, God is apparently helping Jacob in the way he does this kind of selective breeding and stuff with the flocks. It said later in 31 verses 10 through 12, in that verse, we see that God has revealed this plan to Jacob so that he'll be able to multiply the flocks. That Jacob, if he didn't come up with this plan on his own, maybe God revealed it to him in a dream, or God endorsed it and said, yeah, that's going to work, or something. I'm not sure. But God really is the one that, in spite of this scheming that's going on between Laban and Jacob, God is going to make sure that Jacob is blessed and that Jacob is prosperous. So there's some weird stuff that happens in verses 27 through 29. And again, when you read the commentaries on this, nobody really seems to understand what was going on with what Jacob was doing with these flocks. But it talks about Jacob putting sticks with the bark peeled off of them in the water trough. And somehow he uses that to do some selective breeding. And I don't even, somebody in here understand that more than I do? Maybe somebody who actually breeds animals would understand how that all worked. But I don't understand how all that worked, but we know that it did work. Jacob was able to, through some successful breeding, he was able to multiply his portion of the flocks that were spotted and didn't look pristine white.
He's been a shepherd here for 14 years. He's probably had some time to observe genetics at work.
Exactly. And how he bred the strong with the strong. And I don't know, he knew kind of what to do so that he could make the blemished ones multiply and be strong. And then the pure white ones became smaller in number so that Laban wasn't getting as many sheep as Jacob ended up getting.
He might have been just making dye.
Making dye?
What I thought you were going to say.
That's not biblical, but it could have been.
That's what I thought. I thought maybe they it like a little branding mechanism that would just discolor the sheep, until they,
Well,
I don't think he was up to any deception at all. I think he was Jacob, not Laban. Laban was up to
Laban was for sure, but Jacob was doing his part to make sure he knew that Laban was deceiving him.
Right.
And so he was making sure, well, I'm going to make sure I get my fair share, regardless of what Laban was doing.
But it wasn't to be deceptive or to be greedy.
He was just trying to provide for himself and his family.
He made a deal. He's using his knowledge to make his deal prosper.
Exactly. And God
gave
endorsed that. God was the one who really caused him to be blessed, right?
Right.
The fact that he knew how to do that was because God had chosen him and blessed him.
Well, I kind of think it was like Shirley said, that there were two crafty dudes that were trying to outdo each other, because it was Jacob that took Esau's blessing. So that guy's no
we know that Jacob is not perfectly innocent either in his history.
And I'm not saying, I'm just
I do think we know that Jacob does grow in his faith, and so I'm not sure how much of it was him doing it for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. There might have been a little bit of both, right? But he does continue to multiply his flocks. Will you go ahead and read for us, Dave? Read we're in chapter 30, verses 41 through 43.
Sure. Moreover, whenever the stronger of the flock were mating, Jacob would place the rods in the side of the flock in the gutters, so they might mate by the rods. But when the flock was feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger were Jacob's. So the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys.
Right.
He was killing it.
So he was. He was doing it, and God was blessing him. So in our story, it's very clear that God is blessing Jacob in multiple ways. First of all, he blessed him with 4 wives. Although I'm not sure that's a blessing or a curse. He's got 4 wives, and now he's got all these children. He's got 12 children, counting Dinah. Benjamin hasn't been born yet. He comes later. But he has 12 children, including our one token female daughter, Dinah, so to speak. And now God is also
about the Bible. So.
and God blesses him with all this prosperity. He's getting all these. It says he has a large flocks of sheep and goats, lots of male and female servants, because you need a lot of people to take care of all those animals. And he has lots of camels and donkeys too. So he has all these animals. So God blesses Jacob abundantly. And if you think about it, we know from the book of Genesis that by the time Jacob finally leaves Haran and leaves his father-in-law, he has been there for 20 years. So he served for 7 years, then another 7 years, and then he makes this deal with the sheep, and he stays another 6 years. So 20 years, Jacob has had to put up with the greed and deception of his father-in-law, and really just being taken advantage of. And if you read the rest of the story, past today's focal verses, Laban's attitude towards Jacob really sours because he realizes that his plans to cheat him are failing to work, right? So he's upset. He's upset because he hasn't been able to sort of outmaneuver him or cheat him out of what he had planned to do. And Jacob decides to leave partly out of fear. He was actually afraid of Laban and what he might do to him. And so he decides to take his wives. He was also afraid that he might try to keep his wives and his children. But he decides to leave and take all his household, his wives, his children, all the animals and servants, and he decides to go back home to the promised land. Of course, we know that's going to be interesting because his brother Esau is back home in the promised land. And we also know later that Laban came after Jacob and he confronted Jacob for cheating him. And so it's interesting that this whole story is playing out, but he does end up getting away and going back to the promised land. And so in summary, we have in this story today, we have Jacob, whose name means deceiver. He kind of met his match in Laban, who is probably an even bigger deceiver than Jacob ever was. But God's promise, God's covenant promises of blessing to Jacob are going to come true regardless of Laban and his bad intentions with Jacob. You would think that as his father-in-law, he would want Jacob to prosper for his children and his grandchildren. But Laban is really just looking out for number one. He's not even really looking out for his own family. But to me, it says a lot about God. We know that God has this covenant blessing. It started with Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, and then Isaac, his father, and now Jacob. And Jacob is the one that God is choosing to bless. God has selected them to be in the line of Jesus that's going to come later. He's promised to multiply them. He's promised to bless them, and he's promised to bless the entire world through them, because we know that eventually Jesus comes through their line. And it's very interesting, speaking of their line, if you look at the 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, the one that Jesus ultimately comes from is the tribe of Judah here. So Judah is where you go on down the line and you get to King David, and of course King Solomon, and then ultimately to Jesus. So we know that is going to come true, and it happens through the tribe of Judah. So no one can cheat or steal away the blessings that God promises to his people. Like Isaac was trying to give that blessing to his favorite son, Esau. They ended up, of course, tricking him into giving it to Jacob. But God was going to make sure that Jacob was blessed, because that was part of his covenant promise.
And with the, like Esau, and you, in the lesson that you gave, you said that Jacob was trying to pull Esau back into the womb, and Esau actually emerged first, so he was the older son, correct? Mm-hmm. So I was in not an argument, but a discussion with some dudes online, and they were going this, that, and the other. And so I said, well, Esau is Ishmael, and so, which is a Muslim prophet, and so from that, given that the firstborn deserves the blessing, I'm not saying it's correct, but they've got a legitimate point,
Yeah, well, we talked about that. We talked about how, in the world's view, it's the firstborn that deserves the blessing and the inheritance, right? The birthright, so to speak. But we also talked about how in God's view, God is the one who gets to choose. And in many times, God chooses the second born, the second birth. And we talked about how that is a symbol for how we as believers, we have to be born again. We have to be born a second time. The second birth is the spiritual birth. So God actually uses these stories to tell a much bigger story about how he chooses the bloodline of Jesus and how we need to be born again.
It's often a picture of the fallen and then the redeemed. Like Jesus is often called the second Adam. So the first Adam is the fallen Adam. He was the first, but Jesus is the second.
He's
Adam,
the second
who's
Adam.
the redeemed. So
You're exactly right.
yeah. So a lot of times, these times where the first thing seems to be the thing that's supposed to be the blessed thing, it is the second thing that comes out to be the blessed thing, because it's a picture of us needing to do what you're saying with this rebirth. Is
God uses these stories to tell us a much bigger
bigger story. always.
And so I love that. And you know, I love that about God. You know, all throughout the Bible, God kind of flips things upside down. There's a worldview and there's a human way of thinking and doing things, and then there's God's way. And you know, Josh talked about that, you know, one Sunday when he said, what's the plan? God's plan is the plan. The plan is God's plan. So we can come up with our plans and our ways that we're going to do things, but ultimately God's plan, God's will is going to be the one that's going to play out. So, and that's so true. We should be seeking to be part of God's plan and let God work his plan out in our lives the way he wants to.
Well, regardless of if we do or not, he will still do that.
He's still,
anyway.
Despite all the
Despite
maneuverings
our best
and things
efforts,
going on,
God's
God
will
still
still
made
be
sure he knew who had been chosen to be in the line of Jesus Christ. And so God made sure that happened in spite of all the crazy drama and the things that went on with his people.
And you know what I, you know, like I always go back to Romans 8:28, all things work together for the glory of God. So if your intentions are good, you know, you could be the stupidest guy on the planet, but and wrong most of the time. But it's okay. I mean, it's okay because we don't have to be perfect.
God
we just have to be trying.
God,
you know?
in his infinite wisdom, accomplishes his will for us in spite of our sin and our, you know, all the times we get off the right path. God still manages to work those things out for our good. And there's a whole other lesson in there, deep subject matter about the whole, you know, predestination versus free will and how all that plays out. Well, I don't want to get into all that stuff. That's some pretty deep stuff there. But we know that God is going to bless Jacob in spite of what his father-in-law does to him. And he's also going to bless Jacob even when he's not in the promised land. You know, the promised land is kind of a representative of us being in, you know, this world. So in a sense that Jacob was kind of outside of the promised land when he was at his father-in-law's house living for those 20 years. But even when he was outside of the promised land, God still blessed him. And, you know, whether they were in Haran or Egypt or Babylon, wherever they were, God was going to bless his people. And that is a reminder to us, you know, we live in this fallen world. Our promised land is in heaven. It has, you know, this world is not our home. We are aliens in this world as God's people, but yet he is still going to bless us here. Even though we haven't arrived to heaven yet, he's going to take care of us and he is going to fulfill his promises to us, even while we're here in this broken and fallen world. And I don't know, I take a lot of comfort in that. That God's promises to us and his word are true wherever we are in this fallen world. You know, Deuteronomy 28, I probably don't know if I have time to read all this, but I'm going to anyway. There's some beautiful blessings that God gives to his people in Deuteronomy, and they're blessings for obedience. But what's beautiful to me is that because of Jesus, we have the promise of God's blessings even when we are not fully obedient. But I just love to read through it. So this is in Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 through 15. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, and the crops of your land and the young of your livestock, the calves of your herds and the lambs of your flocks. Your basket and your kneading trough will be blessed. You will be blessed when you come in and blessed when you go out. The Lord will grant that the enemies who rise up against you will be defeated before you. They will come at you from one direction, but flee from you in seven. The Lord will send a blessing on your barns and on everything you put your hand to. The Lord your God will bless you in the land he is giving you. The Lord will establish you as his holy people, as he promised you on oath, if you keep the commands of the Lord your God and walk in obedience to him. Then all the peoples on earth will see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they will fear you. The Lord will grant you abundant prosperity in the fruit of your womb, the young of your livestock, and the crops of your ground, in the land he swore to your ancestors to give you. The Lord will open the heavens, the storehouse of his bounty, to send rain on your land in season and to bless all the works of your hands. You will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none. The Lord will make you the head, not the tail. If you pay attention to the commands of the Lord your God that I give you this day and carefully follow them, you will always be at the top, never at the bottom. Do not turn aside from any of the commands I give you today, to the right or to the left, following other gods and serving them. So God promises his people so many blessings. And of course, in the Old Testament, the blessings are contingent upon obedience, right? And we saw that over and over, that cycle of sin and then repentance with the Israelites, you know, all through their history.
And only for the Israelites in that case, but now
it's really for any who believe in God. And for us today,
in the Old Testament, it was the Israelites. I think. I mean, I don't, you know.
Well, there were actually non-Jewish people that believed in God. They're interspersed in some of the Bible stories we read about.
Okay.
So there are some non-Jewish believers
in
in God who were also blessed along the way, that there are some examples of.
It's because like a lot of people, like he had servants here that might not have been part of his actual family, but they came along and were blessed through him. And like whenever, you know, down the road when they come out of Egypt, a lot of Egyptians went with them and they were blessed through them as well. So, but it was basically
and the Ethiopian who that was after Jesus.
Well, and you know, we talk about the bloodline of Jesus, that bloodline of Jesus is going to be through the Jewish people, but there are many other believers in God, like you said, that were part of the Israelite households that were believers in God and had faith in God.
Well, one thing, like you said, you know, you said the bloodline of Jesus. I was talking to another dude. Here's you know. I'm Germanic, okay? My adopted son, Jack, is Choctaw. Jack will never be Germanic, but he's my son. Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. Father Joseph, Joseph was his earthly father, but was not his biological father, and neither was Mary. So it's my belief, my contention, that's why Jesus is for everyone. So it was through the house of David that Jesus came to be, but Jesus is not Jewish as Jacob is Jewish.
Well, he is through his mother. He is.
No, he was a virgin birth. There was no DNA swap because that's what I think. I don't mean to argue with you, man.
Well, he had Mary's DNA.
They to Joseph, not to Mary.
Yeah.
Did I say it again, please?
They traced the lineage from David down to
Mary.
Jesus
Through Mary.
Joseph, not
through Joseph. The DNA?
Well,
you're saying?
Well, they didn't have DNA.
Yeah, I was going to say, how did they do that?
But I'm just saying.
That's the
they
lineage.
traced the lineage, through Joseph.
Yeah. Well, but
Mary's DNA, Mary's lineage is also traced to. They both come from the tribe of Judah.
Yeah, they do.
But it was a virgin birth. There was no consummation. So there was no.
But Mary's DNA was passed on to Jesus, just not Joseph's DNA. It doesn't matter.
Well, and do we even know that God could have used Mary's DNA? He could have created all new DNA. We don't know how God created Jesus in the womb of Mary, and that to me doesn't even matter.
He is for everyone, like your point was.
He is for everyone. And we talked about how Jesus came through a specific bloodline, but through our belief in Jesus as our Savior, when we believe in Him and we believe that He was resurrected, we become adopted into the family of
Yeah,
God.
and
that's where
that's
God
cool.
is
I think me
saying
and Jack, you know.
He's going to control the bloodline of Jesus, but in the end, any who believe in Jesus will become part of the family. We were adopted in.
Yeah.
And so, yes.
All right. I think it's really important to note that God had a plan from the Garden of Eden.
Yep.
He did.
It went back that far because it was after Cain killed Abel, Adam and Eve conceived a third time.
Mm-hmm.
And through that son, we get Noah.
Right.
And then Noah's, not his first born, we're not real sure if he was the second or third son, but it was not
The first
Was
one.
not
It's usually
Ham.
not
was
the first
not
one.
Ham, it was Terah.
Mhm.
And Terah is the one that
Shem.
Abram came from. And then then it goes on down, and it says in Genesis that it would be the woman, the seed of the woman, because Jesus called himself Son of Man,
Mhm.
meaning the woman.
Right.
He was the son of a human.
Yeah. And you know,
And
Go
so
ahead.
I think it goes back, all the way back to Genesis.
It
All of
does.
it does.
and really, God had all this planned really
It was
before
all
He even
figured
created
out.
the heavens and the earth. This was all
Yeah.
planned out, and He knew how this was all going to happen.
Now, our little brains just.
I know. We're right. I do think it's interesting, though. In the Jewish custom, you are considered today. You are considered Jewish if just your mother is Jewish.
Yes.
And Jesus did have a biological Jewish mother.
Yes, he
Well,
did.
So
it was
he
a
is-
virgin birth. if
He
that's-
is
you know.
he is considered Jewish. He was raised in the Jewish faith, and he followed all of the customs of the Jewish people of his day.
Jack pretty much does what I say, but yet
Yeah.
Choctaw.
So, and you know, I'm the mother of 2 adopted
Well,
children
yeah,
too. So
yeah.
I love the way God uses adoption. That's the way He describes how all of us as believers. So whether we have some Jewish blood, and you know what, if we all did our DNA, probably most of us have a little tiny bit of Jewish blood in us somewhere. I found out my daughter Maria does. She's the only one in my family who's done a DNA test, but she was like 2% Jewish. You know, so we all may have a little bit of Jewish blood in us. We don't, unless you've done a DNA test, we don't know for sure. We're all so mixed up now in this melting pot of the United States.
Well, I love, flashing back to last week's lesson after, at Easter when Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, and he tells her, he's speaking to her, and this is Jesus out of his own mouth, and he says, go and tell them I'm going to my Father and your Father,
my God and
my
your
God
God.
and your God.
Yes.
He used to, he has, that's like the official.
That is
Welcome
your.
to the family.
It is
I-
the official
I
welcome to the
just-
family, and so I love that God uses this imagery of adoption. And too, there's all this story too about and this is true today in the United States. Did you know any biological parent can sign away their parental rights? You can terminate your parental rights and you can sign them away. But if you've adopted your child, you can never terminate your adoptive parental rights. You are forever the parent, and you're
Good thing we got
responsible
good
for them
ones,
until
yeah.
they're legal adults. You cannot terminate your rights. Only biological parents can do that. So once you've legally adopted a child, once God has adopted us into His family, He is never going to let us go. He is never going to sign away His rights to us, to the devil. We are forever His. We did get a little bit off the subject today, but it's a good story, and I'll close us in prayer.